Hello, everybody. Welcome to our session, and thank you for joining us. For this session, as part of the panel, we have a panel here which will be discussing outcomes-based financing, specifically for the education sector. I'm sure in previous sessions over the yesterday and today, there's been some talk about that, but our session will be focusing more on how outcomes-based financing can be used in the education sector. To kick off, we want to look at some of the current trends around education. What are the key challenges within the education sector? And then, especially in the light of the current situation or the global pandemic around COVID, and then with all countries trying to recover from COVID, and especially getting children back into schools, I think this is an opportune moment to have this discussion on the trends in education now, the challenges, and of course, the role of outcomes-based financing and what can be done with outcomes-based financing. Of course, it doesn't mean that there are no challenges with that. There are some limitations around that. And so we have a panel here, a very seasoned panel, both within the education sector and also within outcomes-based commissioning, who are going to lead this discussion. We'll have some talk and then we'll open up also for some questions. We also want participants to write out if you have any questions using the Q&A's app application. And then after we're done with the conversation, we can also look at the questions and then answer some of your questions or your questions as they come in. So we'll start off to look at the current trends in education. What are some of the challenges? What are some of the key issues within the global sector around education? And then of course, with COVID coming in, how has the situation been? And then where are we now in terms of COVID recovery or recovering from COVID in terms of the education sector? So I'll kick off with my panel, Diana and Mercedes, to start this conversation around education trends. Let's start with you, Diana.
Awesome, thank you, Kingsley. So the situation before the outbreak of the global coronavirus pandemic was a world that was already struggling with a learning crisis, with 53% of children in the developing world living in what we call learning poverty, which means they are unable to read and understand a simple text by age 10. With the spread of coronavirus, this learning crisis will be even deeper and exclude more kids, and it affecting especially girls, as well as persons with disabilities and other marginalized groups. So the education system is witnessing this extraordinary twin shock, school closures needed to fight the pandemic, and a widespread global economic recession. Just on the school closure sides, at the peak of the epidemic in April, close to 1.6 billion children and youth were out of school, with more than 180 countries mandating temporary school closures. And this loss of schooling means children don't have the opportunity to learn, they forget what they had learned, and they lose learning that comes from social interactions at school that no remote learning can replace fully. When you look at the economic shock, the contraction alone means 7 million of kids additionally will drop out because of the pandemic, because more kids will have to go to work, girls are forced to stay home, students are disengaged on this learning process. Just to not end on kind of like this sad note, what we do see too is some 130 governments investing heavily in multi-platform remote learning and using this period to plan for when schools reopen. So this is an opportunity to build an education system that is more resilient, adaptable to student needs, equitable and inclusive, with a strong emphasis on the role of technology in teachers training at scale and education delivery. This feeling is that we cannot waste the crisis, and that the shock might have lasting negative impacts, but it must be an opportunity to accelerate, not to go back to where we were before. Kingsley, you were muted.
Yeah, thank you. So we are looking at both opportunities and challenges and opportunities within the sector posed by COVID there. Mercedes, what do you have to say in terms of the trends also and some of the challenges and opportunities around education at this time?
Thank you very much for being in charge of this panel of wonderful women, first of all. I think that I imagine ourselves in the middle of a suspended bridge, in the middle of the bridge, in the middle of two big mountains. the mountain that we are leading behind is a mountain of the system that we knew until COVID. And now we are transitioning towards another place. We don't really know how that is going to look like, but we are full of trends and challenges, but also of an amazing momentum of opportunities. As Diana said, we are leading with a very important amount of inequalities, most of all in Latin America and Caribbean areas, where the poorest kids are the ones that are going to be more damaged by this locked down and out of school. In Argentina, we are already under 170 days without attending to school. So as Diane said, the dropout, not also the dropout or the future dropout of schools, but all the known elements and models and mechanisms of teaching and learning had been absolutely changed. So something very important right now for me, and this is going to the mountain of challenges and opportunities, is that for the first time, we have learned more in seeing teachers acquiring ICT and digital tools for reshaping their teaching in these last months than what we have seen in the last 10 years. So every new challenge is going to be in the way of how are we going to reshape the learning. Not also the teaching, but the learning. Teachers are going to be learners for the rest of their lives. So the profession is changing because the model of learning is changing also. I think that something that it's going to be a huge challenge for those who are thinking on investing and governments trying to finance this crisis has to do with how clear we are going to be to make acupuncture right now. Where are we going to make laser focus? Because when you're in a crisis, you cannot attend everything as you were doing it before. So now we have to, first of all, get the in a very first place, kids, poorest and more disadvantaged children, but also girls. Girls are at a huge risk because girls are in a situation where they can get pregnant during their childhood, they can be exploited. So we have to make and embrace the UN campaign about girls, I think. Then if we are going to make a very good investment, because all the budgets are constrained, because government have to face also the health crisis. So we have to have a very, very fine focus on the teams within the governments who are leading this crisis in education. Evidence-based decisions, mapping the poorest areas or the more disadvantaged places. So how are we going to reach that? The huge inequality of access to internet. Connectivity is very important right now, but it's not everything. In Latin America, 90% of the systems are going through this crisis on radio, TV, and WhatsApp. So the challenge here is how are we going to attend the most disadvantaged areas. The amazing opportunity is that we are envisioning the future. This is the future of learning, and future is happening right now. The good news is that we are ready to be able to accept the situation. We have to stop thinking about the mountain that we have left behind, because that is not going to be exactly the same ever, never. So now we have to make networks, learn together and share good practices among countries, because this is a very collaborative learning moment for all of us. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Mercedes. So yeah, obviously the connection between education and economics is there. Also, education itself becoming a solution, even though there are challenges, but it's also becoming a solution there. And I like the idea of the changing role of the teacher also. The teacher beginning to also become a learner in the sense of the new technology coming up and how they can all fit into this new sphere that we have. But then now we want to look at the impact financing, the role of impact financing, the role of outcomes-based financing, and what role these instruments have in terms of the recovery. How can we use these instruments? Sometimes when we talk about impact-based finance, it looks kind of very like rocket science and all that. But then we also have an education sector, which is all our everyday life. How do we use this kind of mechanism to support this recovery and to be sure that we are on track to meet all these opportunities that we are talking about, even though there are challenges as well? Inga, let me start from you.
Hi, everyone. Of course, a very good question. Maybe I'll start with a small retrospective. We all witnessed in the past decade this shift of development finance from input activities and financing input to shorter term outputs. And now we're talking about longer term outcomes and focusing on those outcomes. And this trend trailed the demand for greater accountability, for more transparency, and for leveraging additional finance into infrastructure and social sectors overall in order to address development challenges. And this shifting of focus from input to outputs and then greater emphasis on outcomes also meant that the payment metrics and the system and the projects, the way we design them overall, become more closely aligned with the ultimate development objective of the project or the intervention that we have in mind. But it also brought this financing challenge, meaning that where would service providers that cater to the beneficiaries get their money from, and how are we sharing the risk, and are we equal in sharing this risk? Because overall, historically, particularly for social sectors, it was the public finance that took on the risk of performance, the risk of financing. And to look back to what Diana and Mercedes were saying, of course, COVID also brings this opportunity. The pandemic brought the opportunity for us to reconsider some of the education finance instruments, particularly because this pandemic heightened the inequalities in the children's population. And performance-based structures, or focusing on outputs and in particular on outcomes, allow us to narrow these inequalities by targeting the specific populations that are lagging behind, that are not benefiting from the system that is serviced by overall basic education. And through these performance-based structures, we can introduce ancillary services that would support the education system and would target this population. And at the World Bank, we have a longer history of results-based financing or performance-based schemes where we targeted either out-of-school children, or we had programs that looked at gender gap and targeted girls. For example, we did that in India extensively. We looked at improving the access to quality education for deaf children in Vietnam, where we're paying the schools and training institutes against metrics that encourage them, put incentives there to use Vietnamese Sign Language with the deaf children, and therefore integrate them further into, mainstream them further into the education. So when we're talking about impact investment, of course, there's a great opportunity here for impact investment to participate and to contribute to improving the quality of education. There's a great benefit in using outcome-based financing, both for the beneficiaries and the implementers, the service providers, because they're given this flexibility to innovate, to learn, to adjust, course correct, in order to achieve those final outcomes. And maybe one last point to this particular intervention and particular question is that I personally believe there will be a higher prevalence of performance-based instruments in all sectors and in education including, because with this pandemic, we've all witnessed a falling GDP, global GDP and national GDPs. As a result, the ODA is shrinking. and the ability of governments to put more money towards social programs is falling as well. Therefore, the opportunity for commissioning for outcomes and therefore delaying some of these payments for a later date, while at the same time sharing the responsibility for catering to the beneficiaries, I think will be attractive, more and more attractive to the governments and the development community overall.
Thank you, Inga. Yeah, Charlie, I would want you to add to that in terms of the role of outcomes-based financing. And whilst you are at it, it'd be good to also touch on whether this mechanism or this instrument is the right tool at this time, given the emergency situation, the pandemic, and the need for children to get back into schools, the need to get these outcomes quickly enough. Are outcomes-based financing the right mechanisms for this recovery process?
Thanks so much, Kingsley, and I hope everybody can hear me okay. My name is Charlie Morgan. I'm a Senior Policy Advisor at the newly formed Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office here in the UK. So thanks to all the other speakers, first of all, for their excellent points. And I first of all would just kind of like to echo some of Inga's points. Excellent, thank you. Inga's points on kind of the importance of impact capital at this time from a government perspective. I think it's so incredibly important, as she mentioned, you know, that this economic recession is causing a massive cut to aid budgets around the world. Here in the UK, for example, our aid budget's tied directly to our gross national income. So it represents 0.7% of that. And so obviously when that shrinks, your aid budget shrinks, and we have to make these very, very difficult decisions in terms of what to fund. And in these circumstances, the normal immediate response of spending is directed straight towards the most immediate challenges, and non-urgent services can be deprioritized. So governments at that point have this dilemma to try and make a fiscal space, basically, to be able to continue the provision of essential services. And this is exactly where these types of models, impact bonds, outcomes-based commissioning, can be so helpful and so useful for economic recovery, because they use private capital to provide upfront funding for programs that neither the providers nor the government at that time have resources for. We're able to gain fiscal space by only paying for interventions once they've been successfully delivered. And this allows us to focus our spending on the immediate priorities in the interim. And I think this is also a really important thing to note, that I believe this is a very mutually beneficial arrangement, because it's about this collaboration and this partnership for taking responsibility for the recovery across multiple sectors. You've got socially motivated private sector institutions and private individuals who are coming in and helping to contribute to the global recovery by kind of helping to plug these significant funding gaps that we're seeing in certain services, especially in education. So that's the first thing I'd like to mention and just really highlight about the use of these models. I think Inga spoke quite a lot about recovery and how outcomes-based programs can make that a lot more equitable. And I completely agree with that. I think when you are focusing on outcomes as the basis of your project, you are able to weed out some inequalities by providing incentives. So for example, the FCDO have recently contributed to the Education Outcomes Fund in Ghana, which is looking to improve learning outcomes for primary school children and reduce the numbers of out-of-school children. And as an outcome payer, we will pay a higher price for the education outcomes achieved by girls as opposed to by boys. And this should hopefully incentivize the education providers to be really inclusive, to find solutions to the barriers of girls attending school, and to avoid cherry picking when delivering their services. So I think that could be a really good model. Coming to your question about whether or not this is always the correct choice for an emergency situation, I would say if you want something done fast, impact bonds might not be the best way to go, because they do take time to develop. There are still a lot of challenges in design that we are taking some time to figure out. They take a while to launch and to get off the ground. But if you want something done well, they can provide the right conditions for really high quality results. If you're looking for a longer term solution that can prioritize better outcomes, improved services and higher levels of efficiency, then I'd say impact bonds or outcome-based commissioning have all the elements that we consider incredibly important. For example, they promote really good delivery, they promote high performance management and really good monitoring, excellent use of data and technology, and an ability to adapt to uncertainty. And all of these characteristics provide a very high level of resilience, which enables impact bond projects specifically to actually course correct in the event of poor delivery of unforeseen, in the event of poor delivery or unforeseen circumstances, such as the current pandemic. And a recent study that was done by Brookings, which was based on a survey of about 20 impact bonds, actually found that these elements, along with others combined, create quite an important safety net in the time of a crisis. And just to give a particular example of how that could work, in the Quality Education India Development Impact Bond, which is one of the projects that we're funding through the Development Impact Bond Pilot Programme, which is the one I manage at the FCDO, because they're so focused on outcomes, providers have been working really, really hard to find alternative routes to learning provision so that they can still meet their targets. Those targets are the absolute aim of the programme, and that means that the outcomes of the beneficiaries involved with the project are always the priority of decision making. That is incredibly important in an emergency situation because it means that you're keeping a razor-sharp focus on the people that you're working with rather than thinking about the inputs or the outputs.
Thank you, Charlie. And I like the idea, the fact that even though we are in emergency and we want to quickly get back on the road to recovery, we're still looking at long-term solutions, not just quick fixes as well. And listening to you, it looks like impact investments is kind of a good mechanism for that. We have a question. Let's see, from Raphael. Alistair, can you let Raphael speak?
Yes, just give me 1 second and I will get there. If Raphael, if you can be ready to speak. Kingsley, I'm going to come back to that. Give me a moment. We'll try and get Raphael on the screen in just a moment, if you can keep moving forward.
Yeah, Diana, do you want to add something to what I've been talking about so far?
Yeah, sure. Maybe one thing that comes to mind is how important remediation strategies are when schools reopen. And now that, in some countries, schools have already reopened. Remediation meaning bringing kids back to the level where they were supposed to be, so that we are teaching them at the right level. And I think remediation to ensure that learning losses don't become permanent. This is one case where OBF approaches are probably very suitable.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I think we have Rafael now. Rafael, can you go ahead and ask your question?
Hello, how are you? Thank you very much. Well, my question is if it is possible to pay for results in a context where it's difficult to define a baseline or a control group or a comparison group. Which strategies do you suggest to do it?
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you, Rafael. Inga, do you want to take that?
Sure, I can start. Is it possible to pay for results without a control group or having a project without control group? My response is yes. I personally think that randomized control trials are rather expensive. They are not always necessarily called for. However, if we're talking about a performance-based, a results-based scheme, I do think, and I'm curious to hear from Raphael, what instances it would be difficult to define a baseline, because a starting point or a comparison, particularly if you're not having a control group, is absolutely necessary for a performance-based scheme. And even if just focusing on your targeted population or the group that you're designing the performance-based scheme for, and create a baseline there, that would it's still way better than not having one. And I can't imagine that any investor, if we're talking about an impact bond, would take a financial risk in a project in which there's no good metric or data to work with.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Mercedes, you want to jump in on that?
Yes, I would like to say, in my experience after 10 years in public service at the Ministry of Education in different levels, one of the baselines here, Rafael, I think it's I repeat this all the time, the team capacity to lead this crisis. So a baseline is evidence, use of evidence and data, creating data, having data to make more accountable the decisions that you make. Accountability is very important right now. The teams that you're going to have dealing with mapping the most strategic areas where you have to intervene. That's the base for me, because as in the middle of the crisis, you don't really know how is it going to be and how is it going to look like in the next 2021. I assume that we are going to still be in a lockdown or something like a blended learning system. So all the focus should be in how are you going to lead with this? How are you going to reinvent the system? Because every budget today, 90% is given to pay salaries for an old structure. So here we have to really rethink, first of all, because before investing in it's like reacting to what is happening, we need to plan a full strategy to move towards what is coming next.
All right, thank you. So for our invited participants, so we said that there's a Q&A session if you have any question. Alternatively, you can also raise your hand and then we would let you see if you have any question to put there. Yeah. So in terms of, again, some of probably the limitations around impact investment and all that. Charlie, you want to talk about some of the limitations around that? And obviously with this first question, it brings us the fact that without a baseline or in a situation where you don't have a rigorous control, it gets a bit challenging in that sense. What are some of the limitations in terms of using this kind of mechanism, especially within the pandemic era, as part of the recovery process?
Thanks, Kingsley. Yeah, absolutely. First of all, I think Raphael's question was quite pertinent. Obviously, one of the things I mentioned earlier is if you're looking for a quick fix, an impact bomb might not be the tool for you. And the reason for that is because you do really want good data to base your intervention on. When you're defining those outcomes, that is probably the hardest part of the entire process, which is why the design period takes quite a long time. You need to really know the cohorts that you're working with, really understand what progress means for them, ideally involve them in that discussion as well and find out what's, have that kind of participation with your beneficiaries. And so all of these things, they are quite difficult to do at a time of crisis, and also at a time when we're having to socially distance and where many people have limited access to technology. So that's one thing. I'd also say, there are pros and cons to using this model. One big pro, obviously, is that it can involve a lot of partnership working, a lot of collaboration with different stakeholders. But that can also sometimes mean that you have a lot of different people around a table who all want slightly different things. The process of getting through those negotiations when you're dealing with this type of tool can be quite difficult, but I also believe it's a very important learning process, and everybody that I've spoke to, different stakeholders in impact bonds, have all felt that ultimately, even though it is a difficult process, it can lead to a much better service delivery ultimately. So I think the way we see it, there are definitely limitations to the tool. I don't think it's helpful necessarily to take a very binary approach to this question. I think we see it as an additional tool in our toolbox that can help us achieve development outcomes where it's appropriate to do so. We definitely wouldn't say this is the best tool all the time, but there are times when it is absolutely an incredible tool to use. And I think, for example, looking at the Quality Education India, the development impact bonds results of year 2, for example, were incredible. They were obviously performing, I think students in their schools were performing nearly twice as better as schools, control schools, for example. And so you see incredible results when you use the tool, but I don't think necessarily it's the first choice for a rapid response. So I think that's what I'd contribute to that.
Yeah,
and I can add to that, if I may, Kingsley. Fully
Yes,
agree that it's not a response tool as a rapid response tool. However, if you are implementing an impact bond and a pandemic hits or any other humanitarian natural disaster, it doesn't mean that its flexibility allows you to actually navigate hardships like this because all stakeholders are involved. It's a very collaborative tool, as mentioned. And secondly, you can also switch for the period of hardship from outcomes payments to short-term outputs that would be linked to a recovery track until the operation can get back onto its outcome-based payments. Do not launch impact bonds probably in a pandemic. Your baseline will be off. You are in an unusual situation. However, if there is one ongoing, I think it's a really good instrument to navigate through a hardship situation. It's also a very good period of time to design future impact bonds. As I said, I think the demand for performance-based schemes will be higher and higher, both for financial reasons, but also for risk sharing reasons. So this is a good time to think about them, assess the situation and design to eventually be launched at a later date.
Yeah, and related to that is the question of how do we make this whole process probably less difficult? Because that's kind of, Charlie talked about the partnerships, the negotiations, and all that. But then again, we also want to get spot on. We're looking long term, but we also want things to start like yesterday. How do we make this process less difficult in that sense? Yeah. Inga, you want to take that again?
Sure. I feel like the answer to me became obvious by now from working so much on outcome-based financing, including impact bonds. We've agreed, so there's this impact bond working group going on for a couple of years now. And when we assess the challenges, the barriers, we've all agreed that the one big elephant in the room is the lack of outcome-based financing committed to pay for outcomes. And several agencies in the room started working towards when incentivizing the creation of more outcome funds out there, and others even launched them, including at the World Bank. A few months ago, we launched our outcomes fund, and this outcome fund will not only help governments pay for outcomes in across sectors, infrastructure and social sectors, but we also put aside time and money to go towards capacity building of governments, capacity building of the market, knowledge sharing, and help grow this this market going forward. So, sorry, one way of making or contributing towards an easier launch and more performance-based schemes out there is to have this type of outcomes funds and help governments make funds available to commission for outcomes going forward.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And I'll jump to Mercedes. I mean, you have the government experience. Governments want processes to move. Like yesterday, they want to see things happening. They have electorates, they have kids, their parents, and all that. Listening to Inga and Charlie, what do you make of all this in terms of the process, and then how do we get this working quickly?
Well, I would like to say that as I have been working with different international groups, financing different projects in Argentina, national government, and at Buenos Aires city level, something that for me is very important is that these plans should be shorter, clearer, and simple, more simple. Sometimes you want to reach every single problem in a government, and we have a very short term to do all the things that we want to do. So we should focus on which are the real problems that we need to solve first. And sometimes those real problems are behind the scenes, are back office, have to do with why don't these investment groups maintain the focus on how important it is to build human capacity within the local governments. Because if not, you bring your amazing teams to work with your team in the government, and then you leave, and they keep always trying to learn how to do the plans, how to read the outcomes, design the outcomes. Now we are facing new outcomes. Which are those new outcomes that we have to finance? So training the team, making shorter plans, more accurate, again, acupuncture. What is exactly that we need to be financing? Because effective use of budget is something that many governments, most of them, are having a very big difficulty in this. During G20 sessions from Argentina's presidency in 2016, this was in our agenda. We have been discussing how to have more efficient use of budget. It's not always more money, but it has to do with how are we going to invest and make that money the best for the kids. Thank you for the opportunity.
Okay, thank you. So we just have about 3 minutes, so I'll just take a quick round starting from Diana. Any last words from the panel? Yeah.
Well, sure. I think, there was a lot of different viewpoints that in a sense tell a very similar story, that outcome-based finance was already being used in education. Yes, the situation did change. We do have a crisis, but that still means there are important uses. It's just that we also have different challenges. And but this, again, it's a crisis that should not be wasted. There's a shock that might have lasting negative impacts, but this can be seen still as an opportunity to rebuild better. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Inga, any final words?
Just maybe one last thought, and that is just to mention that COVID-19 did indeed highlight for us the importance of blended finance and bringing the risk down to manageable levels while continuing to maintain the focus on the service delivery to vulnerable groups. You will notice from my title, I'm an infrastructure specialist. We are doing this extensively in infrastructure sectors, and I don't see the reason why we would not bring the same mindset to social services, social sectors, and allow for these structures in which the risk is shared. We can blend finance as long as we are reaching the vulnerable, we are providing the services to them. I'm highly in favor of outcome-based financing, including impact bonds and other results-based blended finance approaches.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, Charlie, how about you?
Thanks, Kingsley. I would say, for me, the most important thing is when we're looking to recover from this crisis, we need to think about inequality, and we need to think about inclusion and making sure that everybody is brought along, because everybody has been affected very, very differently by this pandemic. And I would say, tools such as impact bonds can be an amazing way of doing that. But if you can't launch an impact bond right now, at the very least, try to prioritize the outcomes of the beneficiaries involved, because that should help ensure that nobody gets left behind in the recovery.
Okay, thank you. And finally, Mercedes.
You're on mute, Mercedes.
Mercedes, you're on mute.
So, thank you. I trust in the capacity of different governments to work together, and more than ever, we need to keep on learning about this, because during the crisis, sometimes we're so focused on dealing with the problem that we're not noting down the good practices, what has been working and what has been not working. So learning together, and this is something that we are seeing around the world, and this is great. For example, this summit. So keep on having us together so that we can learn and feel that we are dealing with this as a global team and not different local governments trying to do their best. So thank you for this opportunity.
Okay, thank you. So I would like to thank the panelists and also our audience for this. This has been a lively session. For me, my takeaway is that we shouldn't let this crisis, we shouldn't waste the crisis. And obviously the need to focus on outcomes for the beneficiaries. So even though there's a crisis, we want to also be sure that beneficiaries are getting the outcomes needed and money is being invested wisely and effectively. So thank you everybody, panelists and audience for this session. Thank you very much.